Welcome to biology. In this video, we are going to review both aerobic and anaerobic cellular respiration. Now, to begin, remember the term aerobic. This means that this process requires oxygen. And this overall process of cellular respiration follows the equation of one molecule of glucose, which we represent as C6H12O6, and that's our glucose, plus 6 molecules of oxygen, or O2. Those are our inputs to this overall reaction. They go through the process and the reaction, which is represented with the arrow, to produce 6 molecules of water, so H2O, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, and a whole bunch of ATP, which is cellular energy. Now, the process of cellular respiration is a multi-step process, and our first step in that process is glycolysis. The second main step is the Krebs cycle, However, before the cell can start the Krebs cycle, it needs to undergo an intermediate step. The final step in cellular respiration is the electron transport chain. Now, within each of these steps, there's several products that are produced and then subsequently used. Now, we follow these arrows to see where those products are transferred. There's these really cool products called electron carriers, and the process of glycolysis produces electron carriers called NADH, and the process of the Krebs cycle also produces NADH, but it also produces this other electron carrier called FADH with a little 2. Now, these electron carriers carry those electrons produced or collected in those first 2 steps and delivers them to the electron transport chain, which is the final step in the process. Now, I also want to remind you that these processes occur in separate locations within the cell. We have glycolysis that takes place in the cytoplasm, and the intermediate step, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain, those take place in the mitochondria. Now, I want to also remind you that the Krebs cycle might be known as a different term in your notes. So the Krebs cycle is also called the citric acid cycle. So AKA citric acid cycle. Now, the main purpose of doing cellular respiration is to produce ATP, and that ATP is produced in glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Glycolysis produces 2 ATP. The Krebs cycle also produces 2 ATP. And the electron transport chain, this produces approximately 32-ish ATP. Now, I also want to remind you where each of these pieces of the equation are found in each step. So our ingredient of glucose. This goes in at glycolysis. Our ingredient of oxygen, this enters cellular respiration in the final step in the electron transport chain. Our 6 molecules of water are actually produced in that electron transport chain, and our 6 molecules of carbon dioxide are produced in the Krebs cycle. Now, ATP is made a little bit in each step. We get the bulk of our ATP from the electron transport chain. We also get a little bit from the Krebs cycle and a little bit from glycolysis. Let's look at glycolysis in a little more detail. Now, glycolysis is step number 1 in cellular respiration. This is the first step, regardless of if you are doing aerobic or anaerobic cellular respiration. Now let's talk through this diagram a little bit. To begin with, we start with glucose, and that glucose needs a little activation energy to get started. In fact, we add in 2 ATP as our activation energy. Now the phosphates from the ATP break off and they attach to either end of the glucose molecule, and this causes the glucose molecule to split. We add another phosphate to either end to help stabilize things, and then we have this goofy molecule called NAD+ that comes in. NAD+ is an electron carrier when it is empty. When it is fully charged, we call it NADH. But we have to remember we do this to both sides since that glucose was split in half. So on the other side, we also have NADH. Now this NADH that's produced, this is actually used in step number 3. After we create the high energy electron carrier of NADH, we are also going to produce 2 more ATP on either side of this diagram. Now this ATP is our product. However, we are producing 2 from each side, but we had to use 2 to get things started. So when we look at our net or total ATP, we produced 4, but we used 2. So our net is 2 ATP. Now if we look at our glucose, we started with glucose, we split it in half, and now we have this pyruvate. That pyruvate is going to be used in step number 2. So we started with glucose at the top, we ended with 2-pyruvic acid or pyruvate. We also started with 2 NAD+ and a bunch of electrons and hydrogen, and at the end those joined together to produce 2 NADH. Now I also want to review the location and the inputs and outputs summary. Now as you're studying, you're going to want to pay particular attention to this summary over on the right. So our location of the first step, which is glycolysis, takes place in the cytoplasm. The inputs involved in glycolysis include glucose. That's the main one to be worried about in this instance. The output includes ATP, pyruvate or pyruvic acid, and a little bit of the high energy electron carriers of NADH. Now that we have finished step number 1, cellular respiration continues with this intermediate step. So we start by taking our pyruvic acid, also known as pyruvate, and it goes through a series of reactions that produces a little bit of carbon dioxide, and it produces a little bit of NADH, but ultimately the real goal is to create acetyl-CoA. Now, acetyl-CoA is used in the Krebs cycle, which is also called the citric acid cycle. So the Krebs cycle would be step number 2 in cellular respiration. The citric acid cycle gets its name from the first main component that is produced, which is citric acid. However, that citric acid is very quickly broken down and turned into something else. So what you need to know is that the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, produces some more carbon dioxide. It produces some NADH, or those electron carriers. Again, these are going to be used in step number 3. This also produces a little bit of ATP and another electron carrier called FADH with a little 2. Now again, FADH2 is going to be used in step number 3. So also, as you are studying, it's important to remember that this is the step that makes carbon dioxide. So this is the reason why you exhale carbon dioxide. So let's fill in our summary over in this space on the right. The location of step number 2 is in the mitochondria. The inputs include those products from our first step, which was pyruvic acid, also known as pyruvate, and our outputs include 4 things. We produce a little bit of ATP, we produce a little bit of carbon dioxide, we also produce NADH and FADH with a little 2. Now remember, the NADH and the FADH2, these are electron carriers, and these are needed to start the electron transport chain. The third step in aerobic cellular respiration is the ETC, which is the Electron Transport Chain. So this is step number 3. So the electron transport chain is taking some of the products from the earlier steps and using them to build a concentration gradient that is then used to produce ATP. So we start with the NADH that was produced from steps number 1 and 2. We also have the FADH2 that was produced in step number 2. And these carry their electrons to the electron transport chain, which move through a series of reactions that are pumping hydrogen ions across the inner membrane of the mitochondria. So these are pumping them from the matrix space to the intermembrane space. Now this active transport is building more hydrogen on one side than the other. And as these electrons move through that series of reactions, eventually they need to stick to something, and this oxygen is the final electron acceptor. So this is why we need to inhale oxygen. So what happens is when the electrons are accepted by the oxygen, we produce H2O, which is water. Now these hydrogen that have been built up on the one side of the membrane, these are eventually going to use passive transport to move through the ATP synthase, and as they move through ATP synthase, that extra phosphate is attached to the ADP to produce ATP. Now this is where the bulk of the ATP is produced within cellular respiration. So again, let's summarize the location, inputs and outputs. The location is in the mitochondria. The inputs include the NADH, the FADH2, and oxygen. The outputs include H2O, or water, and a whole bunch of ATP. Now let's review what would happen if we did not have any oxygen. So we would have anaerobic respiration taking place if there is no oxygen. So if there is no oxygen around, we are going to do anaerobic respiration. Now it's important to remember that all cellular respiration starts with glycolysis. So all cellular respiration starts with glycolysis. So this is a key piece of information that you need to know. So what's happening here is the pyruvic acid that's produced in glycolysis is what actually starts fermentation. So let's walk through the two types of fermentation. So on the left, we have alcoholic fermentation, and on the right, we have lactic acid fermentation. Let's start with alcoholic fermentation. Again, remember, we're starting with glycolysis, and at the end of glycolysis, we produce pyruvate or pyruvic acid. This is then converted to acetaldehyde. This is then turned into acetaldehyde, which is then turned into ethanol. So alcoholic fermentation, this is performed by yeast and plant cells. And this is in fact the process that helps to make bread rise. Now, if I were to write out the equation, we would start with glucose, and that would be turned into pyruvic acid. This initial process right here, this is glycolysis. Now that pyruvic acid is then turned into ethanol and carbon dioxide and a little bit of ATP. So where we start with pyruvic acid ending with ATP, this is the actual fermentation process. If we are to look at lactic acid fermentation, this is performed by animal cells in the absence of oxygen. In fact, this is the process that causes your muscles to be sore after a good workout. If we write out this equation, we can see that we start with glucose, and that glucose is quickly converted into pyruvic acid. Again, this process is glycolysis. Now that pyruvic acid is then converted into lactic acid, and ultimately it is then converted into ATP. So the process of going from pyruvic acid and turning it into lactic acid and ATP, this would be fermentation. So again, you will notice that glycolysis is the first step in both alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation. However, they each produce slightly different byproducts along with ATP. So in summary, let's look at cellular respiration as a whole. And no matter what the process is, we always start with glucose. And that glucose is converted into pyruvic acid using that process of glycolysis. Then our next step depends upon if oxygen is present or not present. So let's pretend no oxygen is available. We are going to go into anaerobic respiration. This could take two different forms. This could be alcoholic fermentation, or this could be lactic acid fermentation. If oxygen is present, we are going to go into aerobic respiration. This would start with glycolysis and then move to the Krebs cycle. And then finish off with the electron transport chain, or the ETC. Now again, let's review our products. If we have anaerobic respiration, we are going to produce 2 ATP from 1 glucose. Again, remember, no oxygen is required. And this is also called fermentation. And again, if oxygen is present and we have aerobic cellular respiration, we're producing a whole lot more ATP. In fact, it's approximately 36 ATP from 1 glucose. This does require oxygen. However, the waste from this particular process, so our waste product, would be carbon dioxide and water, so H2O.